In the humid darkness of a September night in 1944, on a small coral island in the Western Pacific, something unprecedented in the history of warfare was about to unfold. The island of Peleliu, no larger than Manhattan's Central Park, was about to become a furnace that would burn throughout the night, illuminating the Pacific sky with an unholy glow that could be seen from ships 20 miles away. For 3 years, Japanese soldiers had dismissed American flamethrowers as crude weapons of limited effectiveness. During the Guadalcanal invasion, and for almost every subsequent invasion, Japanese flamethrowers were captured, but the Marines quickly discarded them as too small and with too little firepower. The Japanese military leadership had observed American flamethrower tactics with a mixture of contempt and professional interest, viewing them as desperate measures employed by an enemy that lacked the spiritual fortitude for close combat. But on the night when Peleliu burned, everything changed. The small coral island would become the crucible where Japanese soldiers discovered that their enemy possessed not only superior industrial capacity and firepower, but also the willingness to unleash weapons of such devastating psychological impact that they would fundamentally alter the nature of warfare in the Pacific. The stage for this transformation had been set months earlier, when Peleliu was going to be the proving ground for a major shift in Japanese tactics. Tojo advocated what later became known as Fukaku tactics. This envisioned a war of attrition that would make the Americans pay dearly in blood and treasure for every position they gained. The Japanese high command believed they had finally developed defensive tactics that would blunt American offensive capabilities and force them to reconsider their advance across the Pacific. The Japanese would use natural features to their advantage by constructing pillboxes and bunkers amid coral ridges and rock outcroppings. They would also make use of natural caves, enlarging them to provide cover for hundreds of soldiers. On Peleliu, this philosophy reached its ultimate expression. The Burgol contained some 500 limestone caves, connected via tunnel by Japanese engineers. Many of these caves were former mine shafts developed by Nanyo Kohatsu Kaisha, South Seas Development Company, a Japanese firm established in 1921 primarily to develop the sugar industry in Saipan, where its headquarters were located. However, the company also owned and worked the phosphate deposits on Peleliu. The Japanese defenders, under the command of Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, well known to be courageous and a superb tactician, had spent months preparing their defensive positions. The mines and caves were turned into defensive positions. Engineers added sliding armored steel doors with multiple openings to many cave entrances, providing extra protection and concealment for artillery and machine guns. Cave entrances were opened or altered to be slanted as a defense against grenade and flamethrower attacks. This last modification would prove to be a critical adaptation based on previous encounters with American flamethrower tactics. The Americans, however, learned very quickly that they could not clear caves by throwing in explosives or using flamethrowers anymore, as the Japanese had also improved their cave-digging techniques so that slanting cave entrances deflected the damage caused by such weapons. The Japanese believed they had solved the flamethrower problem through engineering. When the American assault began on September 15, 1944, Major General William Rupertus, the commander of the 1st Marine Division, predicted that the island would be secured within 4 days. However, after repeated Imperial Japanese Army defeats in previous island campaigns, Japan had developed new island defense tactics and well-crafted fortifications, which allowed them to offer stiff resistance and extended the battle to more than 2 months. The initial phase of the battle seemed to confirm Japanese confidence in their defensive preparations. The battleships Pennsylvania, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Idaho, heavy cruisers Indianapolis, Louisville, Minneapolis, and Portland, and light cruisers Cleveland, Denver, and Honolulu, led by the command ship Mount McKinley, subjected the 6 SQMI, 16 km island, to a massive 3-day bombardment, pausing only to permit airstrikes from the 3 aircraft carriers, 5 light aircraft carriers, and 11 escort carriers that sailed with the attack force. A total of 519 rounds of 16 and 410 mm shells, 1,845 rounds of 14 and 360 mm shells, and 1,793 500 bomb, 230 caliber bombs pounded Peleliu during this period. The Americans believed the bombardment to be successful, as Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf claimed that the Navy had run out of targets. Yet in reality, most Japanese soldiers survived. Even the battalion left to defend the beaches was virtually unscathed. When American forces landed on the beaches, they immediately encountered resistance far more sophisticated than anything they had previously faced. The Japanese had learned from past attacks, however, and they took a new strategy, aimed at bogging the enemy invaders down for days and inflicting massive casualties in hopes of pushing the Allies into a negotiated peace. Peleliu's many caves, connected by networks of tunnels, allowed the Japanese to hunker down and emerge mostly unscathed from the Allied bombardment. The early battles followed patterns that had become familiar in the Pacific theater. Marines would assault Japanese positions with conventional weapons, supported by backpack-type M2A17 and M22 flamethrowers, finding them useful in clearing Japanese trench and bunker complexes. The well-known use of the man-portable flamethrower was against the formidable defenses at Tarawa in November 1943. But on Peleliu, these tactics met with limited success. The Marines found the best method for clearing a cave was to douse the interior with unlit napalm using a flamethrower, giving it a few moments to let the volatile vapors build and permeate throughout the cave. Then toss in a satchel charge or white phosphorus grenade to ignite it. In theory, and sometimes in practice, the rapid ignition of the napalm completely consumed the cave's air supply, in turn collapsing the lungs of the Japanese defenders. On Peleliu, though, there wasn't always enough time to employ the best clearance method. The quickest way was to give the cave a couple of bursts from the flamethrower and shoot the survivors as they exited the cave. But the Japanese defenders had prepared for these tactics. Their slanted cave entrances and multiple exits allowed many to survive flamethrower attacks that would have been lethal in more conventional positions. Bunkers cleared with flamethrowers and grenades were often reoccupied shortly afterwards by Japanese troops moving underground. This tactic caused many casualties among the Marines, as they walked past reoccupied bunkers without expecting to suddenly take fresh fire from them. As the battle progressed into its second week, American casualties mounted to staggering levels. The Japanese inflicted 70% casualties on Puller's 1st Marines, or 1,749 men. The carefully engineered Japanese defensive system was achieving its intended effect. The Japanese fighting spirit was so fierce that Major General Roy S. Geiger of the Marines repeatedly noted Peleliu was the toughest battle of the entire Pacific War. Most veterans of the battle, even the few older men who had seen combat in the ferocious trenches of WW1, agreed. It was during this critical phase of the battle that American forces began to employ flamethrower tactics on a scale never before seen in warfare. Coleman and Harris adopted siege tactics, using bulldozers and flamethrower tanks to methodically destroy Japanese positions and pushed into the ridges from the north. The Americans had brought to Peleliu not only the standard man-portable flamethrowers, but also large flamethrowers mounted on LVT-4 Amtraks at Peleliu. Late in the war, both services operated LVT-4 and 5 flame tanks in limited numbers. Even more significantly, American forces developed innovative delivery systems for incendiary weapons. They made liberal use of tanks and flamethrowers, even improving upon the vehicle-mounted flamethrower. They thrust a gasoline pipeline forward from a road-bound gasoline truck, thereby enabling them, with booster pumps, to throw napalm hundreds of feet ahead into Japanese defensive areas. The tactical philosophy of the American assault evolved into what became known as the corkscrew and blowtorch, that employed the satchel charge and the flamethrower as the only means of marking progress. Marine demolition squads were in heavy demand on Peleliu, armed with satchel charges and backed by flamethrowers. They operated by a simple if dangerous creed: blast 'em, burn 'em, and then blast 'em again to seal the deal with rock slides. But it was not until the night assaults began that the true effectiveness of American incendiary weapons became apparent to the Japanese defenders. The sun went down, beginning a new phase in the battle for the hill. The Japanese launched a series of counterattacks that lasted all night. It was a time when the sounds of men screaming for help or crying in pain mingled with the staccato chatter of gunfire, a terrible cacophony that echoed and re-echoed through the darkness. During these night battles, American forces began employing a new tactic that would fundamentally alter Japanese perceptions of flamethrower effectiveness. Rather than simply using flamethrowers to clear individual caves or bunkers, they began using napalm and white phosphorus in coordinated area bombardments designed to set entire sections of the island ablaze. After that, they called in napalm drops, waited for the jellied gasoline to seep into the porous rocky ground and the caves below, and then ignited it with phosphorus mortar bombs. When all else failed, they sealed the caves shut with bulldozers and dynamite, trapping Japanese soldiers inside. The porous coral limestone of Peleliu proved to be the perfect medium for this new form of warfare. The napalm would seep into crevices and underground passages, creating a network of flammable material that could be ignited simultaneously across large areas. When the phosphorus mortar rounds detonated, they would create a chain reaction of fires that would burn for hours, turning the night sky orange and filling the caves with superheated gases and toxic smoke. American forces used flamethrowers and napalm to great effect, and heavy artillery and air attacks provided essential support. Eventually, armored bulldozers collapsed cave entrances, entombing Japanese soldiers within the bowels of the earth. The psychological impact of these burning nights on Japanese defenders was profound. Men who had been trained to die for the emperor, who had shown contempt for American softness and technological dependence, found themselves facing a form of warfare that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about combat honor and effectiveness. The physical evidence of what these fire attacks achieved remains visible on Peleliu today. In one cave in the southern ridges above the airfield, the team uncovered a particularly vivid tableau of a flamethrower attack. A gas mask was melted to the wall with bone fragments inside, suggesting it was being worn at the time of the attack. A burst canteen lay on the floor. The water inside their canteens had turned to steam and exploded, popped like balloons from the inside, says Knecht. And there were human long bones driven into the ceiling and sides of the cave like big white spikes from the force of the explosions. In the same cave, the archaeologists found a poignant reminder of the soldiers who died in the attack: a stack of melted 78 RPM phonograph records. As the Americans advanced slowly up the mountain, taking horrendous casualties as they did, and causing the troops to name it, with typical Marine Corps black humor, Bloody Nose Ridge, they resorted to using flamethrowers to clear the caves. Today, you can still see the scorch marks on the wall. The effectiveness of these fire attacks was measured not only in Japanese casualties, but in their psychological impact. Bulldozers were brought up to clear routes into the many canyons to allow flamethrower-equipped LVTs and tanks to support the advance, and artillery was positioned on the West Road to fire at point-blank range at the west-facing cliffs. These tactics continued, slowly reducing the pocket, for the next 6 days. Hill 140 was captured in a well-orchestrated attack from 2-5 that allowed a 75mm pack howitzer to be brought up, sandbagged in place, and fire on many of the larger caves that had been firing to such devastating effect on the attacking Marines. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers began to experience what American forces had long known, that flamethrowers were not merely weapons of local tactical significance, but instruments of psychological warfare that could break the will of even the most determined defenders. Flamethrower operators were usually in more danger than regular troops, as the short range of their weapon required close combat, and the visibility of the flames on the battlefield made them a prominent target for snipers. Still, they were essential to breaking the dug-in enemy. For better protection, flamethrowers were mounted on flame tanks, and one battalion commander called these the best single weapon of the operation. The night battles at Peleliu marked a turning point in Japanese military thinking about American flamethrower capabilities. Prior to Peleliu, Japanese military doctrine had viewed flamethrowers as weapons of limited range and effectiveness, suitable primarily for clearing bunkers and trenches, but not capable of decisive tactical impact. At the beginning of the war in the Pacific, the U.S. M1 flamethrower proved to be very unreliable, while there was a desperate need for a reliable flame weapon to use against the determined and deeply entrenched Japanese soldier. During the Guadalcanal invasion, and for almost every subsequent invasion, Japanese flamethrowers were captured, but the Marines quickly discarded them as too small and with too little firepower. However, the Marines had been premature in their decision not to use captured flamethrowers on the enemy. After they had been shipped back to the Chemical Warfare Service in the U.S., it was discovered that the Japanese flamethrower had numerous superior features. These features were analyzed, copied, improved, and incorporated in the design of the M22, which replaced the M1. But the fire that raged through Peleliu's coral caves demonstrated that American flamethrower technology had evolved far beyond the simple weapons that Japanese forces had previously encountered. The coordinated use of man-portable flamethrowers, flamethrower tanks, napalm airdrops, and phosphorus artillery created a synergistic effect that was devastating both physically and psychologically. Each had to be neutralized with satchel charges, grenades, and flamethrowers, often at great cost. Finding it nearly impossible to dig foxholes in the tough coral, the Marines piled rocks and coral around their positions. The Americans had adapted their tactics to the unique terrain of Peleliu, but they had also adapted their weapons to create effects that no previous Pacific battle had witnessed. The scale of American firepower employed at Peleliu was unprecedented. Over the course of the battle, the Americans unleashed an astounding barrage of munitions. Navy ships anchored offshore fired almost 6,000 tons of shells. Navy and Marine aircraft dropped at least 800 tons of bombs. In their month on the island, the Marines expended almost 16 million rounds of ammunition, including 116,000 hand grenades. Within this massive expenditure of munitions, the proportion devoted to incendiary weapons was remarkable. The Americans had brought to Peleliu not only conventional explosives, but also vast quantities of napalm and white phosphorus, turning the small island into what amounted to a controlled experiment in area denial fire warfare. The Japanese response to these fire attacks revealed the depth of their miscalculation about American flamethrower capabilities. Many Japanese soldiers on Peleliu died of starvation, thirst, suffocation, and concussions from blasts inside the caves. 49 Japanese soldiers who were not killed and failed to surrender were sealed inside their caves with cement. A few of them managed to dig a passage way between the rock and cement and escape. The decision to seal caves with cement represented a Japanese acknowledgement that conventional defense against flamethrower attacks had failed. The slanted cave entrances and multiple exits that had been designed to deflect flamethrower blasts proved inadequate against the sustained fire attacks that characterized the later phases of the Peleliu battle, as the fierce resistance of the Japanese was not enough to silence them. The U.S. forces decided to begin a systematic undermining of the entrances of the caves with explosives, destroying them and burying alive those who were still in them. The evolution of American tactics at Peleliu demonstrated a willingness to employ increasingly desperate measures to overcome Japanese defensive positions. But from the Japanese perspective, these tactics represented something more fundamental, a demonstration that their enemy possessed both the technological capability and the psychological resolve to wage warfare of unprecedented destructiveness. My dad drove an amphib with a flamethrower on Peleliu. He said that the violence was unbelievable, especially on the beach. Very violent death. He told me a lot of what happened. It was so bad, and it went on for weeks. They used to use the flamethrower on pillboxes and caves. The smell of burning flesh was something he never forgot. You can see his amphib in action with the flamethrower in some film footage taken there. For Japanese soldiers who survived the fire attacks, the experience fundamentally altered their understanding of American military capabilities. The assumption that Americans were too soft to wage sustained attritional warfare was challenged by the relentless application of increasingly sophisticated fire weapons. The belief that superior Japanese defensive engineering could neutralize American technological advantages was shattered by the coordinated fire attacks that turned their carefully prepared positions into death traps. The influence of the Peleliu fire attacks extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Drawing inspiration from Japanese defensive tactics used in the Battle of Peleliu, Kuribayashi designed a defensive strategy that broke with traditional Japanese military doctrine. Rather than establishing defenses on the beach to contest the landings directly, he opted for defenses in depth. Kuribayashi's troops constructed a complex system of mutually supporting fortifications, often linked by a vast tunnel system, equipped with heavy machine guns and artillery. But even these improved defensive tactics, employed later at Iwo Jima, were designed with full awareness of American flamethrower capabilities, as demonstrated at Peleliu. The Japanese military had learned that American forces were willing and able to sustain fire attacks of unprecedented duration and intensity. Sadly, the hard lessons in overcoming the attritional defenses on Peleliu, with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and napalm, were not transmitted to the Marines that assaulted Iwo Jima 3 months later. They had to be relearned, at great loss of life. The American military, however, had learned valuable lessons about the psychological impact of sustained fire attacks. The sight of an island burning throughout the night had demonstrated that flamethrowers could serve not merely as tactical weapons, but as instruments of strategic psychological warfare. The huge tunnel complex in the Umurbrogol was still occupied, and after attempts were made to persuade the Japanese to surrender, the caves were sealed shut, only to have 5 bedraggled survivors dig their way out in February 1945. For a while after the end of the Second World War, rumors persisted about surviving Japanese soldiers still hiding out in the mountains and swamps of Peleliu. After several attempts to persuade them to give themselves up failed, a former Japanese admiral was brought to Peleliu to talk them into surrendering and that they could do so with honor. On 22 April 1947, a lieutenant with 26 men from the 2nd Infantry Regiment and 8 from the 45th Guard Force sailors emerged, their battle for Peleliu finally at an end. The fact that Japanese soldiers remained hidden on Peleliu for nearly 3 years after the end of the war speaks to the psychological trauma inflicted by the fire attacks. These men had witnessed the failure of their most sophisticated defensive preparations and had seen their carefully engineered positions turned into furnaces. The experience had shattered their confidence not only in their tactical doctrine, but in their fundamental assumptions about warfare itself. The lasting impact of the Peleliu fire attacks can be measured in several dimensions. Tactically, they demonstrated that coordinated incendiary weapons could overcome even the most sophisticated cave defenses. Strategically, they proved that American forces possessed the logistical capability to sustain area-denial fire attacks over extended periods. Psychologically, they shattered Japanese confidence in their defensive engineering and forced fundamental revisions in their military doctrine. The reduction of the Japanese positions in the pocket around Umurbrogol Mountain has been called the most difficult fight that the U.S. military encountered during the entire war. The 1st Marine Division was severely mauled and remained out of action until the invasion of Okinawa on 1 April 1945. In total, the 1st Marine Division suffered over 6,500 casualties during a month of combat on Peleliu, over 1/3 of the entire division. The 81st Infantry Division also suffered heavy losses, incurring 3,300 casualties during its tenure on the island. The cost of the fire attacks at Peleliu was measured not only in Japanese casualties, but also in the toll they took on American forces. The Battle of Peleliu resulted in the highest casualty rate of any amphibious assault in American military history. Of the approximately 28,000 Marines and infantry troops involved, a full 40% of the Marines and soldiers that fought for the island died or were wounded, for a total of some 9,800 men, 1,800 killed in action, and 8,000 wounded. The high cost of the battle was later attributed to several factors, including typical Allied overconfidence in the efficacy of the pre-landing naval bombardment, a poor understanding of Peleliu's unique terrain, and overconfidence on the part of Marine commanders, who refused to admit their need for support earlier on at Bloody Nose Ridge. Yet from the perspective of Japanese military doctrine, the significance of Peleliu lay not in the casualty statistics, but in the demonstration of American willingness to employ weapons of unprecedented psychological impact. The sight of an island burning throughout the night, with flames visible from ships 20 miles away, represented a form of warfare that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of military conflict. The effectiveness of the fire attacks was enhanced by the unique geological characteristics of Peleliu. During the battle, much of the island was completely denuded of vegetation by intensive bombardment from air, sea, and ground. What was left was a moonscape of jagged white limestone that tore up the soldiers' boots and uniforms, abraded their skin, and mercilessly reflected the tropical sun, sending temperatures soaring as high as 115 degrees Celsius. This denuded coral landscape provided ideal conditions for sustained fire attacks. The porous limestone absorbed napalm and allowed it to penetrate deep into cave systems, while the lack of vegetation eliminated natural fire breaks that might have contained the conflagrations. The reflective properties of the white coral amplified the visual impact of the fires, creating a psychological effect that extended far beyond the immediate target areas. The Japanese soldiers who witnessed these fire attacks carried their memories back to Japan, where they influenced post-war assessments of American military capabilities. The image of Peleliu burning throughout the night became a symbol of American technological and psychological superiority that would influence Japanese military thinking for generations. It also likely influenced war planners when considering the cost of invading the Japanese main islands. The Battle of Peleliu impacted the decision to drop atomic bombs to end the war. The demonstration of American willingness to employ weapons of mass psychological impact contributed to Japanese recognition that continued resistance would result in escalating levels of destructive warfare. The archaeological evidence discovered on Peleliu in recent years provides continuing testimony to the effectiveness of the fire attacks. American troops fire a flamethrower at the entrance to one of the several hundred caves on Peleliu, in which the Japanese holed up during the Battle of Peleliu. Nara, RG 127. During the battle, much of the island was completely denuded of vegetation by intensive bombardment from air, sea, and ground. Back on Peleliu, it was low tide when we ducked into a large cave in the Brogol foothills. Rocks surrounding the entrance still bore scorch marks from a backpack flamethrower or perhaps one mounted in a tank or LVT. These scorch marks, visible more than 70 years after the battle, provide silent testimony to the intensity of the fire attacks that transformed Japanese perceptions of American flamethrower capabilities. The night Peleliu burned marked more than a tactical victory for American forces. It represented a psychological watershed in the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers who had dismissed flamethrowers as weapons of limited effectiveness were forced to confront the reality that their enemy possessed both the technological capability and the psychological resolve to turn an entire island into a furnace. The fire attacks at Peleliu demonstrated that American forces had moved beyond the tactical use of incendiary weapons to their employment as instruments of strategic, psychological warfare. The sight of coordinated fire attacks burning throughout the night challenged Japanese assumptions about the nature of warfare itself and forced fundamental revisions in their military doctrine. For the Japanese military leadership, the lesson of Peleliu was clear. American flamethrower technology had evolved from a tactical nuisance to a strategic threat capable of negating even the most sophisticated defensive preparations. The carefully engineered cave systems that had been designed to deflect conventional flamethrower attacks proved vulnerable to the sustained area denial fire attacks that characterized the later phases of the Peleliu battle. The psychological impact of the fire attacks extended beyond their immediate tactical effectiveness. The sight of an island burning throughout the night demonstrated American willingness to employ weapons of unprecedented destructive capability, challenging Japanese perceptions of their enemy's resolve and technological superiority. In the broader context of the Pacific War, the night Peleliu burned represented a turning point in the application of incendiary weapons. What began as tactical tools for clearing bunkers and trenches had evolved into instruments of strategic, psychological warfare capable of breaking the will of even the most determined defenders. The legacy of that night continues to influence military thinking today. The demonstration that coordinated fire attacks could overcome sophisticated defensive positions established precedents for the use of incendiary weapons that would be applied in subsequent conflicts throughout the Cold War and beyond. For the Japanese soldiers who witnessed the fire attacks at Peleliu, the experience fundamentally altered their understanding of American military capabilities. The assumption that superior defensive engineering could neutralize technological advantages was shattered by the coordinated application of weapons that turned their most sophisticated positions into death traps. The night Peleliu burned illuminated more than a small Pacific island. It illuminated the future of warfare itself. In the orange glow of napalm fires that could be seen from 20 miles away, Japanese soldiers glimpsed a form of warfare that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about military conflict and technological capability. When the fires finally died down and the smoke cleared, The landscape of Peleliu had been transformed from a green tropical island to a moonscape of white coral and black char. But the transformation was more than physical. It was psychological. Japanese soldiers had learned to fear the flame not as a tactical weapon, but as an instrument of warfare capable of turning the night itself into an inferno. The small coral island of Peleliu had become the crucible where Japanese military confidence in their defensive capabilities was finally and definitively shattered. The sight of their most sophisticated defensive positions burning throughout the night had demonstrated that their enemy possessed weapons, and the will to use them, that could negate any defensive preparation they might devise. In the end, the night Peleliu burned marked the moment when Japanese soldiers learned that American flamethrowers were not merely tactical weapons of limited effectiveness, but instruments of strategic warfare capable of turning an entire battlefield into a furnace. The lesson would influence Japanese military thinking for the remainder of the war and establish precedents for the use of incendiary weapons that continue to shape military doctrine to this day.